Now we're going to import and apply our flavor logos. So let's go ahead and add a clip. We're going to load all three of these images. And the reason we're not loading them up into the shader tree directly is because we want to do all three at the same time. And that's just not possible from the shader tree without having materials created for each. And we only want one material. And the reason we only want one material is because we want to be able to swap out one of these logos with another. So we'll select all three of these. We got cherry, pineapple, and pine tree. Hit open. And now we have these in our image list. Before we actually throw these into the shader tree, let's multi-select these by holding the shift key and then clicking the topmost, or you can just control click each one like so. And we need to turn off the color space adjustment that Modo is making for us. We'll set this to none because, as previously mentioned, they're already how I want them. We'll be doing the cherry one to start out with. And what we can do is just drag and drop it into the shader tree. Before we do that, we want to make sure we do it into the correct group. And being in the last video where we set up the top front logos, that's where we're going to be placing it. So we don't have to make another group for this. And we'll place this at the top. Obviously, it's quite large. But first, we need to move it in place. Let's use the Move tool to place it. But before we do that, I can tell that we are not able to see the texture locator in the 3D viewport. And the reason that's happening is because the texture locator is set to UV map. So let's go to the properties tab and under texture locator, change the projection type to planar. And now we can see our texture locator in the viewport. So we want to place this on the top left-hand corner. And we could just generally align it here. And let's make sure it's projected along the Z, which it is. And now what we need to do is scale this way down. And you can activate the scale tool with the R key. And in item mode, just scale this down. And you'll, oops, that's a little too much. Okay, so now we can see our item here. And it's still large, but we want to turn off the horizontal and vertical repeat because we only want one of these to show up in the viewport. And we'll scale this down a little bit more. And I want this to fit snugly, similarly to the Modo's logo. Okay, right about there. Now, I also don't want it to be facing this way. I want the one with the eyes to be on the right. And we can do this one of two ways. We can either rotate the texture locator 180 degrees on the Y, or we can change the scale to be a negative value. And whichever way works for you is good. But I have been using the rotation of 180 degrees. That is more or less where I want it, although I do want that stem on top to be a little more visible. All right, so that's pretty close. Let's scale it down a little more. And that's getting me very close to what I want. Now we can move this down a touch more. Okay, I like that right there. That's exactly what I want. And so now we have it placed and set. What we need to do now, similarly to the Modo's logo that we did earlier, is to create instances and set those as specular and bump maps. Let's go ahead and set that up. We'll right click on this layer and we'll hit create instance. And now we can set this to specular amount. And as we had with the Modo's logo, the specular amount is awfully high, and we want to match the specularity of this material with our new cherry one as well. So we'll set this to 2%. And we also want to invert the layer to match the Modo's logo layer. Otherwise, the specular hit and reflectance hit will be somewhat different between the two, and we want them to be the same. Okay, next up, we need to do the bump. So let's right click on the specular layer that we just created for the cherry Modos, and we'll hit duplicate. The reason we're duplicating the instance is so that we don't have to make another instance. It's basically the same, except that we already have these parameters set up for a grayscale image from the previous one. So it cuts down on some of the work that you have to do. All right, so let's right click on the effect. And we're going to set this to bump. And so now it kind of pops out a little bit. And now when we want to use one of these other flavors, all we have to do is go to the original referenced item, select it, and under the texture layers tab, we can swap out the images. And you can see they show up in the viewport. So there are a couple of discrepancies, like the size is a little off, and of course it looks squashed, which isn't what we want. And we can adjust that a little bit later, but we have our basic components all set up. Okay, back with the cherries. The biggest benefit to setting our scene up like this is that when we change the main referenced item to another image, all of those other images are affected by those changes too. So the bump and the speck layers automatically get those new images. And since we already have those nodes set up or layers set up to be grayscale, it automatically set up for speck and bump without us ever having to do any more work. Now we're going to apply the starburst that appears behind the cherries on the top here. So let's open up that group in the shader tree. And what we want to do is limit the starburst to that group as well. So we'll be creating it inside of that top front group. And we're going to import our burst in a different manner as we've done previous. We'll go to add layer. With our top front logo selected or anything in this group, we'll go to add layer, image map, and we'll go load image, and we're going to load up the burst. Okay, so now it's already in this group. However, it's automatically set to use a UV map, and we want to do a planar projection along the Z. You can see we're getting some overriding color above our other applied images, and that's actually our burst image. It's a white color, which is the same color as this box. We have a couple of things we want to turn off for this image. First off, we want to turn off horizontal and vertical repeat, but we're going to leave that on for just a minute because it's going to help us locate where that is applied onto our box. We do want to turn off the color space adjustment that Modo is doing for us automatically. And now what we want to do before we turn off the horizontal and vertical repeat is actually move this into place. Let's go into our perspective view. Okay, you can see it's quite large. So it looks like we need to scale that down as well. But first things first, let's go ahead and move this into place. And we know we want that to be slightly behind the cherry, which is somewhere in this general vicinity. Okay, so we'll move that back. Oops. And I'm going to constrain to the z-axis. We'll place it right there. Over to the left a little bit. And down. It's somewhere right there. So we'll just call that good for now. Okay, and now we need to scale that down. We'll activate the move tool with the R key and scale this on down quite a bit. Okay, and now you can see an edge cutting off the Modos and Cherry logos. And that's actually because that image is overlapping. And that the Cherry and the Modos logo you see right there in the OpenGL viewport is a graphical bug. That's not actually what's happening, as you can see in preview. So another way to help us visualize this is to turn off the alpha channel. And we'll use alpha only. And you'll see it converts it to a black and white image, which is actually what we're going to be doing anyway. Although we'll be letting Modo take control of that for us. This is just a good way to help us visualize what we have in the viewport. So let's move this up. And yeah, you can see it's almost dead center emanating from that cherry. I want that tip right there to be right around the center of the cherry. And that is more or less where I actually want it. Now we'll scale it on the X, local X. And before we scale it on the local Y, which means it would move that point, we want to actually move the pivot point. If you click and hold on the item drop-down list right here, you can see we have access to the pivot and center. So select pivot, and then you'll have this black and white circle here. Click on that. Now we can adjust that circle. Activate the move tool, and move this on down to be approximately at the center. Let's hit 2 to go to the front view on the numerical keypad. All right, we'll zoom in fairly close here. We're just going to place this right at the tip. All right, zoom back out. And now what we can do when we scale, go back into item mode. When we scale, we can actually scale from that pivot point. So in the Action Center drop-down list, select Pivot. Now we can scale from that pivot point and also rotate from that pivot point. And what that's going to allow us to do is duplicate these and then rotate them as we need them emanating from that point. All right, now that we have that where we want it, we've got it adjusted and everything is fine. Let's turn off alpha only. And now we'll go to the texture locator and turn off the horizontal vertical repeat as well. Okay, and you can see it's cutting that off there. And it looks like I turned off the alpha channel entirely, or I set it to ignore. What we want to do is use it. So that way it overlays on top of those items. Now that we have it placed where we want it, what we want to do is actually place it behind the cherry because it's emanating from behind the cherry. So to do that, we can just click and drag and drop that below the cherries. But I also want that to be below the Modo's logo. So we'll do that now. And now it's behind everything, but we can't see anything in the viewport. We could use the high value or the low value for that matter to adjust basically the brightness of this. But instead of doing that, we may as well set a color to the material here. And we'll just choose something garish to make it easy to see. And we'll go with a bluish tone here. All right, so with that in place, what we need to do now is right click on that layer, duplicate it. So now we have 2 of these available to us. So what we want to do is rotate that over as well. But before we do that, we need to scale that with the pivot as the action center. And the reason we want to do that is so that the triangle covers the height and the width of the box. So if we just scale this up like so, it's just an arbitrary value. I'm not doing anything in particular. And then we can rotate that. And you can see that it now covers the entire height and width of the box. If we rotate it almost 90 degrees, you can see that it covers all the way to the side, which is exactly what we want. Let's place this right about there. We're going to duplicate 1, 2, 3 more. So we'll just duplicate that last one we did. And then we're going to rotate that one as well. Make sure that you select the action center as pivot when you do this. Otherwise, it won't work how we want it. And I also want to scale this one. Okay, and for action center, we need to make sure that we set this to local. And the reason is because if we don't, the pivot point still uses an automatic axis. And you can see it's pointing perfectly straight up and down, while our object is not. So when we change this to local, you can see that it changes to the local coordinate of this locator. So now we can scale this on the X, and we're going to widen this up a bit, something like that. That looks cool. Let's activate the rotate tool with the E key again and rotate this a little bit. All right, I like it right there. Okay, let's duplicate that one. Right click, duplicate. And now we'll rotate this one over to the opposite side. And what we're going to need to do for this one is actually squash it down a bit. So activate the scale tool. Make sure that we have local set again and scale this down on local Y. That way it fattens it up a bit down at the base. And we'll rotate it a little bit more. Make sure that we have pivot as the rotation. Okay, rotate it up a little. All right, so that's cool, but it feels like there's kind of a gap right here for this item. So what we can do is either rotate it or scale it to get it where we want it. You can activate the translate tool with the Y key. That gives you a scale, translate, and rotate all with one tool. So we'll set this to pivot, local. Okay, so we'll rotate that up and maybe we'll scale this on the X a little. Yeah, that's looking pretty cool. I'll bring that on down just a touch. Now let's do a little bit of cleanup for our shader tree and scene. One of the things that we'll do is group these images in the shader tree with a group material. So we'll go to add layer, group, move this on down below the Modo's logos. Select each of these images and place them into that group. We'll name this bursts. We're not going to change any of the polygon tag types or polygon tags and so on. We're going to leave those be for now. And now that we have that cleaned up, let's go ahead and clean up our texture locators as well. Before we do this, I want to talk about how we can control those texture locators. Previously, we rotated them to get them in alignment for where we wanted them. But let's say you wanted to rotate them as an entire group. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to put a locator in the scene and parent these texture locators to that locator. We'll do that now. In the item list, hit add item. We'll go to locator. Move this up here under texture locators. And what we need to do is to move this up. We'll activate the translate tool with the W key. Move this up. Let's hit numerical 2 on the numerical keypad. And move this right about the middle of the cherry's face over here. Which is right where those bursts are emanating from. Okay. Go to the side view with numerical 3 on the numerical keypad. And move this straight back on the Z. And we'll get this as close to the surface as possible. So just line that up right there. Hit the decimal key on the numerical keypad, and that will take us back to perspective. This locator is a little large, so what we can do with this is to go to the display tab with the locator selected and change the size. And I think about 0.2 is going to give us a size that's a little more manageable. Now that we've done that, we can grab all 4 of these texture locators for the bursts and drag and drop them onto the locator, which we still need to rename. And we'll rename this to burst LOC for locator. Now when we rotate that locator, we rotate those bursts. And now that we've done this, we can rotate each one of these locators, these texture locators, on their own axis with the local action center. So we can rotate like so, or we can rotate them all together at the same time. It gives us a little more control over what we're doing in our scene if we need to modify them. Also, since we're going to be duplicating these a little bit later for another set on the front of the box, this makes duplicating all of these with all of the changes that we've made, for example, changing the pivot point for all of these burst locators, as well as having a parent for each of them. It's going to make our job a little bit easier. Now that we've grouped these texture locators together with this locator, it makes our scene a lot more parsable. And in the shader tree, it makes it a lot easier to see what we have and what's going on at a glance. Now that we have the top burst completed, we want to make bursts for the lower part of the box as well. And since we already have a number of these available to us, we don't need to recreate them. We can just simply duplicate them. So in the shader tree, let's open up a burst group, select all of these bursts, and we're going to duplicate them. So right click, duplicate. And what we want to do eventually is create a selection set for just the front outside of the box. That way these bursts are not applied to the inside of the box. But for the meantime, we'll just move these down to the front material group. We'll open up that group. And what we need to do now is move these texture locators down to the bottom front area. And if we go into the item list, open up the texture group, and then expand the burst locator, we actually have this available to us now. So what we need to do is duplicate this burst locator. Now, so what we can do is right click on it and hit duplicate. And duplicate will not duplicate the hierarchy. That's what duplicate hierarchy is for. So we'll just duplicate this locator, move it above the other one here. We'll rename this to burst lower loc, and we'll rename the one that we already had to burst upper loc. Now in the shader tree, we'll select all 4 of these new ones again. And what that's going to do is select the texture locator in the item list. And now we can drag and drop these onto the burst lower. So now when we select the burst lower, we can move the entire group. Let's make sure child compensate is turned off. Open up the modeling panel. Whenever you use one of the translate tools in Modo, if you've used child compensate, it will remember that as being turned on. So let's turn that off. And we can close that. And now we can move this on down to the front area here. Okay. So as we did with the top part of the box, we're going to need a little bit of color so we can see what's going on. This front material group has no base material. So temporarily, we'll create a new material. Just go to material, place this at the bottom, and we're gonna, yeah, it's already dark, but we can actually just make this a little darker so we can see what's happening. So now we can see our bursts a little more clearly. We can scale them, rotate them, and create a few additional ones. So let's hide these all except for the lower one, this one here. So I quite like this one. We don't need to scale or rotate it yet. We may do that a little bit. Let's unhide the next one. And this one I think needs scaled down a little bit on the local X to thin it down a little bit. But one thing I noticed is that we actually have the locator that is the parent of this selected. So if we were to scale, it would scale the locator and all of its children. We don't want that. So let's make sure that we just have the locator we're working on selected. All right, so now that we have that selected, transform tool with the Y key and make sure that we are in local mode. And what that's going to do is move it on down to the pivot point, like we did in the previous section. And we're going to scale this on local X, thin it down quite a bit, like that. We're going to rotate this on the Z. We'll bring it up like so. All right, let's go to the next one. I think that one's pretty. I think that one's pretty good as well, except maybe we'll rotate it right about there and move on to the next one. So this one definitely needs a little bit of attention. And we'll scale this out on the local Y. And we'll rotate it on the Z as well to bring this on up. And maybe we'll have that one kind of meet with the corner there, like so. Okay, so now we have a void here on the bottom, and we need to create a few more new ones. And the easy way is to just duplicate the ones we already have. Let's select this one on the right, and we'll duplicate that. So right-click, duplicate, activate the transform tool, and now make sure the action center is set to local. We'll rotate this down. Okay, we'll set this one to right about there. And we'll scale this one on the X to break up the uniformity of the burst a little bit. Okay, we'll duplicate that one. Rotate this down here. That looks good. And we'll duplicate that one again. And we'll just keep on going around. Duplicate one, maybe two more times. Looks like one. Okay. So we'll scale this one as well to make it a little fatter on the local X. Actually, we have another one that we have hidden. So let's unhide that one and go back to the one that we just modified. Make sure we're on Action Center Local again. And we'll scale that back down on the Y. And we'll thin this one way down. This will give a nice variation to this side over here. There we are. So now, if we select the locator here, we can move this around on the Y and X, and we can reposition the exact center. So I'm going to place this somewhere more on the right-hand center of the box. All right, so now that we've completed the starburst for the bottom front, we want to make sure that those are not being applied to the interior of the box. And to do that, we need a selection set. So let's go to polygon mode and make our selection set. You can hold shift, press the space bar to go between the different element modes, or just click on it up here. And we're going to paint select this in. Okay, right about there. And now we'll use shift up arrow to expand the selection. Let's zoom in to make sure that we get all the polygons we want. Looks like one more shift up arrow is going to get all of them. So now we have those polygons selected. Let's go to the select menu, assign selection set. We're going to call this one bottom front matte. Okay. Now what we need to do is make a material group for this. So inside of the front material temporarily, let's go ahead and add a layer and then do group. Now we'll select all of these bursts and place those into the group. And now for said group, let's go ahead and name this bursts lower. And while we're at it, we should rename the upper burst to burst upper. We can minimize that group as well. And now with this new burst lower group, let's go to the properties tab, and in the polygon tag type, let's set this to selection set, and then polygon tag to bottom front matte. Okay, so now that we have that all set up, what we can do is bring our burst lower group as a sibling to all of the other groups. And we'll place this one just below the cellophane group. Okay, so now that we have that all set up for us, that material that we created earlier so that we could see the burst better can just be deleted at this point. So select material 2 and delete. Now in the item list, we can minimize these since we don't need to see them anymore. Let's go back to item mode by pressing and holding shift and hit the space key. And we'll pan out a little bit. Now we have a little bit of clutter going on in our scene with all these texture locators. I'm going to make them invisible in the 3D viewport. So let's open up both of these. Click on one, hold down shift and press the lower one, and then we can hold control to multi-select all of these here. Go to the display tab and under visible, set to no. And now we can't see any of these in the viewport. So it's a little cleaner, makes it a lot easier to see what is going on here. Now we're going to change the display shape of the master burst locators. The reason I want to do that is to make things a little bit easier to see for us. So under the display tab still, there's a tab right here that's called locator shapes. Let's click that. We're going to set shape to custom. And in the 3D viewport, obviously the size is a little large. But right off, I also don't want a box. I just want a circle. And 50 centimeters is too large, considering our box is approximately 14 centimeters. So we'll set this to 1 centimeter. Yeah, that's about right. In fact, let's just make it 2 centimeters, so it's a little bit larger. And along the Z is fine. We don't want it to align to the view since we're using it as a projection. I think it makes more sense to have it be facing toward or away from the box. And solid is fine. Now what we can do is go back to 3D shape and go to add draw options. And we want to change the fill color. I want to make these something a little more recognizable. Since we're using these for the bursts and the bursts are white, I think I'm going to stick with white or maybe some kind of slightly light gray color. Right about there should be fine. Now, one other thing I want to do is actually turn off the locator axes themselves. And we can do that back under the locator shapes tab over here. And right here it says style. We want to turn it from add to replace. Now we can see is that ring. Now, before we do anything else, you might be saying, hey, where the heck is that other one that we just created for the lower? It's actually inside and it's kind of difficult to see. So what we should do is move this out and put it more in front of the box. And since we're doing a projection, it doesn't really matter where it's located, but visibility, I would say, in this case is paramount. We could move this one out as well, so that way it's a little easier to see and select. In fact, we'll just put it right there. So now we have just kind of a mini rig going on for our bursts.